They had built their life the way most people build things they intend to keep, carefully, without examining the foundation too closely. Daniel was a man who believed in consistency, the way others believe in prayer, faithfully, quietly, and with a kind of stubbornness that could look like devotion from one angle and blindness from another. Claire had married him for reasons she once understood completely and later could only half remember. The way you forget the specific light of a place you visited, but carry the feeling of it long after. Theirs was not a broken marriage in any obvious sense. It was something quieter and more dangerous, a marriage that had stopped being chosen. What unravels here is not the story of a villain and a victim, but of two people who let the distance between them grow so gradually that neither noticed how far they drifted until one of them reached for the other side of the bed and felt nothing but cool, undisturbed sheets. The Tuesday night ritual had been the same for 6 years. Daniel cooked, Claire set the table, and they ate in the kitchen with the overhead light on because neither of them had ever gotten around to buying a proper dining room fixture. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the kind of small domestic ceremony that holds a life together through repetition rather than feeling. The way a habit becomes a structure before you realize you're living inside it. Daniel was 41, a structural engineer with a quiet face and hands that were slightly too large for the rest of him. He had the kind of personality that people described as steady, which was meant as a compliment but often functioned as a way of saying he never surprised anyone. He read before sleeping, he paid bills early, he remembered to check the tire pressure. He was, by most observable measures, a good man, though he had learned over the years that being good and being seen were not the same thing. Claire was 38. She taught high school English, graded papers in the evenings, and had a laugh that she saved, increasingly for people who were Daniel. She was the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself, not striking at first glance, but accumulating. People warmed to her quickly. She had a way of making whoever she was talking to feel like the only person in the room, a gift she had probably always possessed, but that Daniel had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a painting you walk past every day. That Tuesday, she came home 20 minutes later than usual, set her bag down by the door rather than hanging it on the hook, and moved through the kitchen with a particular ease. Not happiness exactly, something lighter than happiness, something that didn't include him. Traffic? He asked, without looking up from the pan. A bit, she said. Smells good. He served the pasta. She poured the wine. They talked about a parent-teacher meeting she had the following Thursday, about a colleague of his who was being difficult about a load-bearing change on a commercial project, about whether they should repaint the hallway this summer or wait. The conversation moved the way water moves when there's nowhere particularly interesting to go, covering ground without momentum. Afterward, she did the dishes and he wiped down the counters. And for a moment they were side by side, their movements efficient and practiced. And it could have looked, from a certain angle, like closeness. Their friend Marcus had called that afternoon to confirm dinner plans for the following weekend. He was Daniel's oldest friend, a divorce attorney who made dark jokes about his own profession and who had, over the years, become part of the furniture of their marriage, present at most gatherings, familiar with their rhythms, easy in a way that longtime friends become when everyone has stopped performing for each other. Claire had taken the call. Daniel had watched her laugh from across the living room. That particular laugh, full and unguarded, and had felt something he couldn't name at the time, something too small to be jealousy and too persistent to be nothing. He didn't say anything about it. Later, reading in bed, he listened to her moving around in the bathroom, the sink running, the sound of the medicine cabinet, and he tried to remember the last time he had felt genuinely curious about her day. Not politely interested. Curious, he couldn't locate it precisely. Somewhere in the last year? Maybe 2. She came to bed and reached for her phone, and he set down his book and turned off his lamp. And in the dark he stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she'd come in that evening, her bag on the floor, her ease that didn't include him, and the thought arrived so quietly that he almost let it pass. She's somewhere else. Has been for a while. He didn't reach for her. She didn't reach for him. Between them, the sheets remained cool and undisturbed, and the house settled around them with that particular silence that is not peace but its shadow. He started noticing without meaning to. That was the thing he would think about later, that he hadn't gone looking. The observations arrived like objects surfacing in still water, slowly, one after another, each one innocent until it wasn't. Claire began closing tabs when he walked into the room, not with urgency, with the ordinary casualness of someone who'd been doing it long enough to make it automatic. She started charging her phone in the kitchen overnight, which she explained once as better for the battery, and he had nodded and said nothing because it probably was. She mentioned a colleague named Patrick twice in the same week, then not at all. She started exercising again, evening runs that began as 30 minutes and quietly became an hour, and she returned from them not tired but composed. The way a person looks after they've done something good for themselves, or good for someone else. He was not a suspicious man by nature. He had spent most of his adult life being exactly what he appeared to be, and he had tended to extend that assumption to others. But something had shifted in the quality of his attention. He found himself watching her the way you watch something that isn't quite wrong but isn't quite right either. That faint, specific disquiet of a structural element that passes inspection but doesn't sit right. In early March, 3 weeks after the Tuesday she'd come home with that particular ease, they went to dinner with Marcus and his girlfriend Renata, a ceramicist who spoke rarely but with precision. It was a good evening, the kind that flows through wine and shared memory and doesn't ask anything difficult of anyone. Claire was warm, present, generous. She told a story about one of her students that made everyone laugh, and Daniel watched her across the table and tried to remember when he'd last seen her this way around him alone. "You two seem good," Renata said at some point, with a directness that was her particular habit. "We are," Claire said, and she smiled and looked at Daniel, and the smile was real. He could tell the difference, still, but there was something beneath it, not guilt exactly, more like a kind of effort. The way a person performs ease because ease itself has become unavailable. Daniel raised his glass. "We're good," he said, and the words landed correctly, and the conversation moved on. On the drive home, Claire looked out the window while he drove, and he kept his hand steady on the wheel, and they didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. Which wasn't unusual. They were comfortable with quiet, always had been, but that night the quiet had texture, had weight. "Good night," she said eventually. "Yeah," he agreed. "Good seeing them." She nodded and turned the radio up slightly, and he drove, and somewhere in the space between them a question he hadn't asked yet was beginning to take shape. He started keeping notes, not in any dramatic sense, not a dossier, not surveillance. Just small things written in the back of a legal pad he kept in his desk drawer at work, the kind of record a careful person makes when they are trying to understand a pattern before they name it. Dates, times, small behavioral notations. He told himself it was the engineer in him. The need to document before concluding. He told himself he could be wrong. He told himself this twice a day with decreasing conviction. It was during a quiet Sunday morning, Claire still asleep, that he sat with his coffee and stared at the kitchen table and had a conversation with himself that he would never tell anyone about. The honest one. The one where he admitted that part of his reluctance to confront what he suspected was not composure, but avoidance. Because if he was wrong, he would have made something real that was nothing. And if he was right, he would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be about it. And he didn't yet know. He picked up his phone to call Marcus, then set it down. He looked out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree they planted together 5 years ago that was now taller than the fence. He said to no one, "I don't know. Maybe like, share the story or something." He blinked. The words had arrived from nowhere and made no sense, and he sat with the strangeness of it for a moment, the odd sensation of being observed, before shaking his head slightly and returning to his coffee. Upstairs, he heard her moving. The floor, the shower, the ritual of the morning beginning without him. He turned a page in the legal pad and wrote the date, and beneath it, "What I know, what I feel, what I can prove, the difference between these 3 things." He underlined it, then he waited. He did not plan the night. That mattered to him later, that he hadn't staged it, hadn't engineered a confrontation. It had simply arrived, the way certain endings do, not with fanfare, but with a kind of inevitability that makes you wonder how you ever expected anything else. It was a Thursday in late April. Claire had told him she'd be home by 8 department meeting, late one. He'd gotten home at 6:30, made himself a sandwich, sat in the kitchen with a book. At 9:15, she came through the door and her hair was slightly different than it had been that morning. Not messy. Redone. He noticed it the way he'd been noticing things for weeks now, quietly without expression, filing it away. She seemed surprised to find him at the table. "You're still up," she said. "It's 9:15, he said. The meeting ran long. She set her bag down on the floor, not the hook, still, and opened the refrigerator. "Did you eat?" "I did." She made herself tea and stood at the counter, and they had a few minutes of unremarkable conversation about the week ahead. And he watched her, and she didn't know he was watching in the particular way he was. And he thought about how strange it is that intimacy teaches you to read someone so completely that eventually you can see everything they're trying to hide. He set his book down. "Claire," he said. She turned. His tone had not changed. His face had not changed. But she went still in the particular way a person goes still when they have been dreading a word and finally hear it spoken. "I'm not going to ask you to lie to me," he said. "I'm asking you to not insult either of us." She looked at him for a long moment. The tea was steeping. The kitchen light was the same kitchen light it had always been. "Daniel, I'm not angry," he said. And it was true, which surprised even him. He wasn't detached either. This was not performance. He was simply somewhere past anger, in a terrain he didn't have an easy name for. She sat down across from him. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the table and then at him. And in her face he could see the things she had rehearsed and the things she hadn't, the explanations she prepared and the rawer thing beneath them, which was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but something compound, something that had probably been building in her for longer than any of this. "It's been," she started, then stopped. "I didn't mean for it to." Another stop. She pressed her lips together. "I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse." "Then don't explain it," he said. "Just tell me what's true." What she told him took about 10 minutes. She was not cruel about it. She was not kind either, not in a soft way. She was honest, which was its own kind of cruelty, the unavoidable kind. It had been Patrick, the colleague she'd mentioned twice and then dropped. It had been going on for 4 months. It had started as the kind of attention she'd needed without knowing how badly she'd needed it, and it had escalated before she'd had the language to examine what she was doing. "I didn't feel like you could see me anymore," she said. It was not an accusation. It came out quietly, like something she'd been holding too long and could no longer carry. He sat with that. He didn't deny it. He didn't agree with it either. Or rather, he understood that both things could be true simultaneously, that she was right and that it didn't justify anything, and that justification was beside the point entirely. "What do you want?" he asked. From this, from your life." She didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," she finally said. "I think I've been not knowing for a while." He nodded. He stood up, put his book under his arm, and paused at the kitchen doorway. "I need a few days," he said. "Not to think. I've already thought. I just need some time to be quiet about it before we talk about what comes next." He went upstairs. He did not slam any doors. He lay on his back in the dark, in the room they had shared for 11 years, and stared at the ceiling and felt, above everything else, a kind of exhausted clarity, the way you feel when you've been uncertain for so long that even a difficult truth arrives as a form of relief. She slept in the guest room. Neither of them had suggested it. It had simply happened. By June, Claire had moved into a short-term rental across town, a 2-bedroom apartment above a bookshop that she described, to the few people she told, as temporary. The word did a great deal of work in the months that followed. Temporary implied a plan, it implied direction, it implied that the current state of things was a condition rather than a destination, and Claire needed to believe that. She called her sister first, then two friends from college, and in these conversations, she was honest to the degree that honesty is possible when you are also the one who did the damage. She acknowledged the affair. She took responsibility in the way that people who are privately still sorting out responsibility take it. Not minimizing exactly, but contextualizing. The marriage had been struggling for years. We'd grown apart. I was lonely in a way I couldn't articulate. All of this was true. All of it was also a frame, a way of making the story navigable without looking too long at the parts that didn't have easy narratives. What she didn't say in any of these conversations was that Patrick had ended things 2 weeks after everything came out. He had a girlfriend. He had not told Claire this. She had found out the way people find out things they should have asked earlier, and the discovery had arrived not with drama, but with a kind of quiet, particular shame. The specific shame of realizing that someone who made you feel chosen had been making another person feel the same thing, more consistently, for longer. She did not mention Patrick much after that. She redirected her energy into her students, her classes, the small architecture of her new space. She bought a good coffee maker and a bookshelf she assembled herself. She ran in the mornings now, earlier than before, and she found in the early morning streets a kind of anonymity that suited her. No one knowing the shape of what she'd done, no one watching her try to locate herself. She still thought about Daniel, not with longing, or not exactly, with something more complicated, a recurring awareness of what she had taken for granted with such completeness that she hadn't even known she was doing it. His steadiness, which she had experienced as monotony. His presence, which she had stopped engaging with and then missed only after it was gone. She would be in her apartment some evenings, grading papers with the radio on, and she would think, we could have fixed this. If either of us had said something sooner, if I had said something, if he had. The if he had was the part she turned over most, and the part she was, slowly, becoming honest enough to set down. Daniel, meanwhile, had done something she hadn't expected, which was simply to continue, not performatively, not visibly. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, read, slept. He called his sister in Portland once a week. He started running on weekends, not to process anything consciously, but because he'd been meaning to for years, and the absence of someone else's schedule had given him back his evenings. He was not happy, but he was not shattered either. He occupied his grief the way he occupied most things, thoroughly, without display. Marcus came over in July and they sat on the back porch and drank beer and didn't talk about Claire specifically, which was its own form of talking about her. At one point Marcus said, carefully, you could have made more noise about it. Anyone would have. And Daniel had looked at the yard and said, I know. I just didn't want to become that version of the story. Marcus had nodded. He understood the distinction. What Daniel was slowly understanding, and this was not comfortable knowledge, was that the marriage had been a system with two participants, and both of them had contributed to the conditions of its failure, not equally, not in the same way. But he had not been absent without contributing to the absence. He had loved Claire in the way people love something they have fully possessed without the act of choosing it daily. He had confused familiarity with sufficiency. He had assumed that his stability was a gift and had not wondered whether it was being experienced as a presence or a furniture. He was not ready to say any of this to anyone. He was still in the part of the process where you understand something intellectually before you can bear it emotionally, but he was moving, slowly, without noise, in the direction of somewhere he couldn't yet see. In August, Claire texted him, I'd like to talk when you're ready. Not about logistics, just talk. He read it twice, set his phone face down on the kitchen table, and looked out at the oak tree. He typed back, give me a little more time. She said, okay. And it was enough for now that they could still speak in a language that was kind. They met on a Saturday in early October, at a cafe neither of them had ever gone to together, neutral ground chosen without discussion, simply by virtue of being unfamiliar. Daniel arrived first. He ordered coffee and sat by the window and watched the street with the calm attention he developed over the last several months, the kind that comes from spending a lot of time alone with your own thoughts and making peace with what you find there. Claire came in from the rain, shaking water from her jacket, and when she spotted him, she did something he hadn't expected. She looked for just a moment, relieved, not happy, relieved, as if she'd been worried he wouldn't come. She ordered tea. She sat across from him. They were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have shared 11 years and are now trying to locate the appropriate register for whatever this was. You look well, she said. So do you. He meant it. She did, not in the polished way of someone performing recovery, but in the quieter way of someone who had been doing the work, whatever that looked like for her. She told him about the apartment, about a student she'd been particularly proud of this semester, about a book she'd read twice. He told her about a project he was working on, a pedestrian bridge, public commission, the first one of that scale he'd done independently. She asked questions about it with what seemed like genuine interest, and he answered them, and for a few minutes they occupied the space they'd always been good at, the space of ideas, of the external world, of things that had nothing to do with the damage between them. Then she set down her cup. I want to apologize, she said, not as a strategy, not because I want anything from it. She paused. I think I spent the first few months after all of it finding ways to explain myself, and I think I've stopped needing to do that, and what's underneath it is just that I hurt you and I'm sorry. He looked at her. The apology had the quality of something that had been carried for a long time and set down carefully. He could see that it had cost her something, this version, the one without the context, without the mitigating frame. I know you are, he said. That's all. What else would you like me to say? She shook her head slightly, not frustrated, searching. I don't know. I think I thought there'd be more. Anger, maybe? Or, I don't know. Something louder. I was angry, he said. I had months of it. It didn't seem useful to bring it here. She looked at him for a long moment. You're different, she said. I think I was already becoming this. I just didn't know who I was becoming until I had room to. She nodded slowly. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist. A couple walked past the window, sharing an umbrella, slightly misaligned, one of them laughing at something the other had said. Claire watched them briefly and then looked back at her hands. Is there anything left to figure out? She asked. Between us, is there? She stopped. He understood the unfinished question. It was the same one he'd been carrying in some form since that April night. Not the logistics, which were nearly resolved, but the deeper thing beneath the logistics. The question of whether what they'd had could ever be retrieved. Whether retrieval was even the right word for what either of them actually needed. I don't think so, he said, not cruelly. The way you say something that is simply true. She absorbed it. He watched her absorb it. The slight shift in her shoulders, the small stillness that came over her face. Not surprise. She had known. She had needed to hear it anyway. I think I'm still in love with who we were going to be, she said, finally. Not who we were. Who we were going to be. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. I think I am too. They sat with that for a while. The coffee grew cold. The cafe filled gradually around them with the Saturday morning movement of strangers, and they existed in their small pocket of it. Two people who had once been the whole of each other's immediate world, now sitting in careful, earnest proximity, trying to be honest and kind at the same time. He paid the bill. She protested briefly, and he shook his head, and she let it go. Outside, they stood on the damp pavement, and the October air had that specific quality, cool and clean and slightly melancholy, that makes you aware of how much has changed in a year. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said. Then the bridge sounds beautiful, the pedestrian one. I hope so. She nodded. She turned and walked in the direction of her car, and he watched her for a moment, not with longing or anger or grief, exactly, but with the particular quality of attention you give to something you are letting yourself see clearly, maybe for the first time. the full shape of her, the full shape of what they had been. He turned and walked the other way. The city was quiet around him, the streets still wet, the light low and autumnal. He walked with his hands in his pockets, and he thought about the bridge, the weight distribution, the tension cables, the precise calculation of how much a structure must flex in order not to break. And he thought about the oak tree in the backyard, which they hadn't discussed yet, which was still growing. He did not feel free. He did not feel healed. He felt something more accurate and less satisfying than either of those. He felt like a person at the beginning of a longer story, with no map and no audience, walking in the ordinary direction of whatever came next. That was enough. For now, that was enough.